Welcome to the Money Mastermind Show. Let's talk money.
Income, budget, financial plan, investing. All of these are important concepts that we should have in our personal finances belt. But here's another concept that a lot of people miss out on that they need to know as well. Cash flow. Welcome to the Money Mastermind Show. Tonight we are going to talk about cash flow and explain to you why it's such an important part of your finances and what you need to know about it. With us to discuss this are the members of the Money Mastermind Show. We have Miranda Marquette of Planting Money Seeds, Kyle Prevost of youngandthrifty.ca, Peter Anderson of Bible Money Matters, and Tom Drake of the Canadian Finance Blog. We also have a special guest, Ram Palaniappan, the founder of ActiveHours, to help us get our heads around what a cash flow is. Welcome to our show, Ram.
Thank you.
So before we start, if you're watching live, there is a Q&A app. If you have any questions about cash flow, feel free to ask them. We love to answer questions. So you hear the term cash flow a lot when you hear people talking about investing. So they talk about a company and they want to know how good is the cash flow of the company before they invest in it. But I don't think you hear a lot of people talk about cash flow when they're talking about their personal finances. It's I think maybe it's something that we kind of do maybe intuitively sometimes, and we just don't put a name to it. But I think a lot of people just don't really know about the whole concept of cash flow. So what exactly is cash flow? Let's start there. Ram, if you wouldn't mind starting us off and just talk about cash flow and what it is.
Sure. So cash flow really is managing the money that's coming into you, your income and your earnings, particularly relative to your expenses. And so you're trying to manage the timing as well. It's not sufficient to have a certain amount of income in a month that is enough to cover your bills if the bills show up before your income or your payday hits. And so cash flow management is all about making sure that the money comes in time for when it has to go out.
So you're saying it's matching it up, like your pay dates, matching up better with your expense dates.
Yeah, you have to make sure that your inflows come in time for you to meet your outflows.
So how come just having income on its own, why is that not enough? So, I mean, if you're getting paid enough or and such, why do you need to know about the cash flow? Why is the timing part of it important?
Yeah, so it's really simple that if you had a bill that was due, but it was due before payday, and you didn't have enough money, then you would have a problem because you still need to figure out how to pay the bill, or you push back paying the bill, and you pick up the late fees or whatever the other implications are of not being able to pay the bill. So even though you had enough money coming in that week, if it didn't come in time to pay the bill, you're either late on the bill or you face whatever repercussions are there for not paying the bill on time.
So rather than robbing Peter to pay Paul or dipping into things like your savings that you might want for other things, you could better manage when everything matches up so that you don't have those problems or fees that come up, basically.
Yeah, and the whole concept of savings is because of this unpredictability and the timing issue. You have savings because you don't have certainty on what your future expenses are. And you also keep your savings sometimes to manage the mismatch in timing between when your income comes and when your expense comes. Mm-hmm. And so that's why you keep more money than what you always need to either manage the timing or to manage something that was unexpected.
And I think another thing to point out, especially since more and more people are working from home and doing kind of these freelance things, and it's something that I really relate to as well, is we talk about cash flow also has to do with, do you have the money in the bank? So many times, and I'm looking at what I've invoiced, and I'm looking at my stuff, and I'm like, oh, I've got $3,000, but it's not in my bank account. I'm still waiting for a client to pay it. And, meanwhile, the mortgage is due. Well, not anymore, but the rent is due, and all this stuff is happening. And I'm sitting here frustrated because I'm looking at it and going, I should have $3,000. There should be $3,000 here, and it's not. And so I think cash flow has a lot to do with that as well. What it is versus what you expect to be coming in and what is actually in your bank and at your disposal.
Yeah, I really do think that cash flow and cash flow planning is all about staying in control of your finances, keeping in balance your income and expenses, and then also just making sure that your money is in line with your goals that you have for your family. So I think to be able to do that, you need to be spending all of your money on paper before the month even begins, thinking about what income you're expecting to come in that month, what expenses you're expecting to have, and then thinking about when those bills are coming due. Maybe you can space out certain bills at the beginning of the month and other bills in the middle of the month. But again, it's just thinking about the income and expenses that you're going to have during the month and planning it all out before the month even hits.
Oh, you have a regular income. Yay!
That's why we have you on here.
It's interesting to know too that I find that there's very little correlation between investing knowledge and knowledge on how to use your cash flow to the best of its abilities. You can get people that can talk up and down about index funds versus stock picking and dividends versus growth stocks and blah 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 blah. They can discuss all these different theories and talk about hypothetical portfolios, but because they just have no sort of idea or wish to sort of acknowledge the basics of cash flow, they never have an investment portfolio. So they have all this great knowledge built up and sort of no way to implement it because they don't understand the basics of understanding your income and expenses.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it also depends on what you're making too. I found I first came up against the whole idea of cash flow back when I was living on my own, pretty much paycheck to paycheck, and I had one credit card bill that just hit at the wrong time of the month, and I would get paid, and by the time that bill came, I had like just missing it. And I'd be days away from my next paycheck in order to make sure we got paid on time, and it killed me like every month until I was able to better align those things. But there's been other times in my life where we did better with income, my wife and I, where we didn't have to worry so much about what bills were getting paid when. And certainly it's always an important thing, but I think sometimes it depends on what the income is doing and what you have planned out for it as well. So I think sometimes you could be a little wealthier maybe, or just better with your expenses and not always worry about cash flow as much.
One thing I've done with my expenses, being another regular income person, is a lot of biweekly expenses, biweekly mortgage payments, and some various savings I've got are all set to happen a little over half a week after my paycheck hits the bank. So I give enough of a cushion there that the payment will be there, and then a lot of my expenses just come out based on my paycheck, and that takes a lot of the guesswork out of it.
So a lot of what we're talking about here in cash flow, it sounds a little or a lot like budgeting. So how is cash flow different from budgeting, where maybe I'm going through all my finances to make sure that I've got enough to pay for everything? What's the difference conceptually between the two?
I think you can use you can manage cash flow as a way to budget. I think a lot of people, when they think of budgeting, they try to make sure that they're not spending more than what's in their bank account. One of the problems with that is that you don't have a lot of certainty, especially if you're working hourly or freelance, in terms of what you're going to have as income 2 weeks from now. You might get less hours at work. Maybe you were used to overtime. There's no overtime, and so there's variability in your income. And so planning a budget based on how much you have in your bank, doing that like 2 weeks at a time is very tough because you can't actually move all of your expenses up and down very quickly. A a different way to budget is to budget based on your income. So you restrain your spending to how much you earn, and then you know that you can spend more if you've actually worked more. And so you try to very closely link how much you spend to how much you earn, and that's in a way cash flow management. That's also budgeting.
So they can work together. So if somebody's maybe budgeting correctly, they might not be actively working on their cash flow. It's just sort of built into the way that they're budgeting.
Yeah. I mean, cash flow also is managing both sides, managing your income as well as your expenses. And usually when you think of budgeting, you're only managing one side of it.
Yeah, I think that's where the difference comes in for me is budget. Maybe it's just my own personal interpretation, but I feel like it's most closely associated with consumer demands and sort of managing your needs and wants and sort of monthly bills and saving and anticipating major expenses and that sort of thing, which obviously is related to cash flow. But cash flow, I think, has more associations with investment as well, whether you're talking about real estate cash flow, various different side jobs, freelance jobs. To me, cash flow has a more investment-esque quality to it.
Well, I think you make a good point that cash flow also takes into account your income from various sources and not just, this is how much I'm going to spend. So I think it takes it all into account. One of the things, though, that struck me was you were talking about how, Ram was talking about how you can look at it and just, use your inflow and base your budget on that. And I was also thinking of how Tom talks about doing things biweekly. So, a lot of people start out with their monthly budget and say, oh, well, I'm going to do this whole thing for the month, but then they get paid different amounts throughout the month. And so it may not be all coming at once, or it may not all be the same every 2 weeks. And so sometimes you might need to break that up depending on when you have your income coming in. My money never arrives on the same day of the month. It all depends on when the client pays, and sometimes the client will pay 2 days earlier than they did last month, or sometimes they'll pay later than they did last month. None of my money all comes at the same time, and it all comes at different times. And if I didn't have the Canadians who just pay me immediately, if I didn't have the Canadians, it'd just be this total mess. But because everything
you're welcome.
Our dollar's sinking, so don't depend on that. I kind of like this idea of looking at it and breaking it down into smaller bits and saying, what's it going to be this week, what's it going to be this next week. And I have started sitting down and saying, especially since I've moved and my expenses have gone up, I've had to sit down and once a week I've sat down and said, okay, so what does my cash flow look like this week, and what do I need to do this week? What needs to be paid? What's due? What came in this week? And I've had to sit down and really look at that, and and hopefully, as I get used to where I'm at and things smooth out a little bit, I'll be back to where I was back in Utah when it was a little bit easier for me. But I think that that's something to keep in mind with your cash flows, especially if you don't always have your money coming in on at the same time and you can't always predict exactly when it's going to be there. If any of that made sense.
I think so. Basically, the more irregular your income, the more need there is for like a cushion there kind of thing, emergency fund or whatever.
It's like putting together all the different puzzle pieces and making sure everything matches at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think Dave Ramsey talks about people with irregular incomes and how they do have that need for, he talks about regular people having a need for an emergency fund, but people with irregular expenses, how they may need to have an even larger cushion than other folks, just because they don't always know how much they're going to be making month to month, whether it's because of commissions or they're freelance and they don't have as many clients this month. But he also talks about sitting down and figuring out about as far as what your expenses are, and then kind of ranking your expenses on which ones are the most important to be paid. Thinking about your home, your rent or your mortgage, food, clothing, shelter, all that stuff, getting that taken care of first, and then kind of ranking everything else after that. So to me, it's also kind of thinking about, with cash flow management, I think it's more of a daily exercise for me as far as thinking about where I'm at today with my cash flow, knowing how much money I have in my account, what I'm able to do with that cash, and it's more of a daily thing as opposed to the budget where we sit down maybe once a month and look at our budget.
So I hear a lot about making sure that you have the money in your account to pay certain bills here and certain responsibilities, and what do you have left to last you until you get to your next paycheck. Is there room with cash flow to put money aside for other things like savings and investing and so on and so forth? Do we consider that as well? Is it all just like an expense-driven thing, or do we consider putting money away for the future?
I think you definitely consider putting money away. I think you should almost plan for a part of it to be going away towards savings or towards investments. And that's, I think you definitely need to do that because there's always uncertainty about the future. You don't have the long run. There's a lot of things that could change. And so I think you definitely need to think about that as well as cash flow. There are certain pieces of your spend that are discretionary, and there are certain pieces of your spend that are not discretionary. And so you have to pay your rent. You have to do some amount of grocery shopping. You probably think of your utilities, and your phone as also being necessities. So those are the things that you have to do. And then I think you have other ones that are more optional, and some that are like, if you still had money after all of that, you could still do things like going out more often or doing movies or going out for restaurants. But I think there's some kind of prioritization or hierarchy on what you spend, and investments and savings is definitely in that.
Yeah, one book that really sort of changed my view of cash flow and my personal sort of mind, and the book has sort of come under some controversy and some fire for some of the specific things that have been made. So I don't pretend to fully support it, but it's the sort of now famous or infamous Rich Dad Poor Dad book. And but the one good thing that you can take from that book, the one big picture thing, is use your cash flow to buy assets and not liabilities. And I won't get into too in-depth, but the basic idea of looking at what you're bringing in as a tool to gain more, instead of looking at it as just a one-off way to get that next consumer good. And it really changes your mind from an investment perspective when you look at your cash flow that way, I think.
Oh yeah, and even though I have a variable income and I'm up here whining about whatever, the reality is I still have the money that automatically goes to my retirement accounts. I have an automatic plan set up for the taxable investment account that we use as our emergency fund, and that automatically comes out every month. I have an amount every month that comes out that goes into the tax fund to pay the taxes. So I have all these automatic things that do come out, and it's part of the cash flow plan, and those are kind of the things that are ordered first. But like Kyle says, I do think it's important to focus on spending your money on those assets that are going to provide you with something for the future, and not always worrying about, do I have enough to just spend on this disposable item.
Yeah, for me, the cash flow, the flow part of it is, where is all my money flowing to? So that includes expenses, that includes savings, the retirement stuff, and it does tie in very closely with our family budget. We sit down and we figure out what categories we're going to be spending on, and then we do a zero-based budget at our house where we're basically taking every dollar of income and assigning it to a category, whether it's a spending category, retirement category, or whatever. And a lot of times after we've looked at that, sometimes it's a good time to start thinking about where can we diversify a little and start thinking about other sources of income so that we can do more. So.
And I think the flow part of it too is like we were mentioning a little bit earlier, is the timing. When does all of this happen? And I've tried to stagger when everything comes out, so it's not all coming out at once. Staggering when the retirement comes out, staggering when the rent comes out, staggering when the tax, the thing that goes into our tax fund comes out. When all that comes out, trying to stagger it so that it's a little bit more manageable. I think that's a big part of cash flow, is staggering your bills and looking at the timing to make sure that you're not stressing your income at any one point.
So what are some ways that the timing of different income and expenses can get all tripped up regarding your cash flow? Like, what are some concerns that people have to look out for? I mean, we've kind of talked about why it's important, but maybe talk a little bit more about the consequences and what can happen if we're not careful with our cash flow.
Yeah, for me, I've had situations where we've had our mortgage and then auto loan and a couple other things that were all stacked up right at the very beginning of the month. And so early in our marriage, probably when we were making less money, that was more of an issue, because we'd get to the end of the month and we're buying groceries and other things, and now we're getting down to where we need to pay our mortgage and a couple other things, and it's like, oh boy, it's going to be stretched pretty thin. And there'll be a week or 2 weeks where we can't spend any money, basically. So for us, it was hugely important to kind of stagger those things out a little bit better than we had at the beginning, and having our mortgage at the beginning of the month, and then right in the middle of the month we had some of the other bills. So it was much more staggered, much more easy to afford those things all at one time.
So you had to make sure that you had, or that you would have enough money to flow throughout the month, rather than getting tight at some points.
Right. And actually sitting down and planning out when our expenses are coming in, we would just kind of wing it for the most part, just figuring, okay, we've got this much in the account, can we pay the bill? No, we can't, so we're going to have to wait. We're going to be overdrawn if we do, and we're going to have to pay late fees anyway, but we went from winging it to actually sitting down and thinking about these things a little more strategically, and figuring out how we could stagger the bills throughout the month and plan our money better throughout the month, so we're not overspending in certain categories like eating out, which was our big one. We spend way too much money on eating out every month, so it allowed us to think about our cash flow a little bit better and plan out our expenses.
Here's a concept you don't always hear anymore, but used to be pretty standard. Balancing your checkbook. I mean, that seems to be something where if your cash flow isn't set up properly, you can get really stung if you're not balancing things properly, right?
Yeah. We've done some research on what people do when they have bills due before payday. And the most common thing is just not to pay the bill on time and to take the late fee. The second most common thing is to actually borrow money from friends and family. And the third most common thing was to put the charge on your bank account, on your debit card, and just eat the overdraft fee. And you think of like how big a problem this is. In the US, there's $32 billion of overdraft fees a year. That's more than we spend on fresh vegetables. It goes in overdraft fee.
That's a great stat.
Wow.
That's
Not managing this are like hugely expensive.
So invest in bank stocks is the takeaway from that.
At least get something back on it.
Yeah, maybe the worst choice is the payday lenders. And
Right.
there's more payday lending shops in the U.S. than Starbucks and McDonald's put together.
oh my gosh,
Wow, really?
that's a lot.
I did not know that. That's shocking.
I'm not saying that you're not telling the truth. It just seems like it's pretty eye-opening. I mean, there's like a McDonald's and a Starbucks. At least by me, I'll throw a rock and I'm going to hit one of those.
That's what like we try to block out the payday lending shops, from what we remember.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty sobering.
Oh my gosh, now that I think about it, I remember when I was in Kansas City last week, driving by, and there was like this strip mall, and there was like a church, and then a cash loan place, like right next to it as part of the same. First of all, it's like a church and a strip mall, and then right next to it was like this easy cash kind of payday lending place, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, that's messed up.
So cash flow can help you make your money go further or farther. Well, we'll let the English majors out there figure that one out. But by properly allocating your cash flow, you're going to help avoid fees and help avoid the need for something like a payday loan or even just hitting your buddies up for cash, right? So the money that you're making can actually pay for the things that they're supposed to when they're supposed to, it sounds like. The person can really, if they put some time into it, they're going to avoid a lot of fees and a lot of financial heartache, if I'm correct.
Mm-hmm.
So what about, similarly, and not always an evil that people make it out to be, what role does credit cards have in cash flow? And does it have a role?
Yes.
Not in my plan. It doesn't.
Well, we all know what Miranda does over the summer when her cash flow changes. Miranda just charges. So
I guess really, if credit cards become a sort of plan B part of your cash flow, you should just be aware that there are other options, or at the very least, look for the most advantageous credit card that's going to charge you a low interest rate. Hopefully, with some of Ram's tips and some of the different things you see on this show, you'll be able to avoid that, because people that rely on those high-interest credit cards for even just short-term, where it's $10 and $15 interest payments a month, doesn't seem like much, but it adds up to a huge amount over time. So if nothing else, look for a sort of a home equity line of credit, or a line of credit with a much lower interest rate, or at the very least a low-interest credit card, because those can kill you.
I was thinking maybe even more benign than that, and just that a credit card is like a 28-day interest-free loan. So as long as you're paying your bill off every month, and you're not going crazy and putting too many charges on it, you're kind of smoothing things out if you have the self-control to use it correctly. And I think that's probably the danger point for a lot of people.
Well, the nice thing about right. The nice thing about the credit card is you can use it for things. I think it's great for things like utilities, for your satellite TV bill, for the gym payment or whatever. I think it's great for those things because you can put it on them and it's not coming out of your checking account, which you might need for the car loan or the groceries. Well, actually, sometimes I put the groceries on the credit card. But you have this credit card that it's like Glenn was saying, it's a 28-day interest-free loan. You put it on there, but you do need to have that plan to pay it off. You do need to have that kind of way to ease the cash flow. But I can see how it can easily ease the cash flow, because the things that have to be paid out of your checking account, like the rent, the car loan, the student loans, all that stuff has to come out of your checking account. So if you want to make sure that your checking account is free to do that when it needs to be free, especially if you're on a variable income, having the credit card be there to kind of take that pressure off and smooth things over can help. But once again, you have to have the discipline and you have to know that you're going to pay off that balance.
So it's a possible answer or tool, but you do have to be very careful and you have to have a lot of self-control to use it properly.
Yeah, I think that's the key, is you have to have that self-control, be able to know that you're going to pay that card off every month, and it's not going to become an issue where it's revolving every month and you're paying interest fees. I think the problem is far too many people use that as kind of as their default emergency fund, basically, instead of actually building up some sort of a cushion in their bank account, 2 or 3 months of expenses, and having that on hand. Because if you do have that on hand, when you have these smaller instances where you're $200 short or something, that's easy enough to just transfer the money right over from your savings account or whatever. But again, you have to have the ability to actually stick to it and save that money ahead.
So what, besides using maybe a credit card, what are some other strategies that people can use to smooth over parts of their cash flow that aren't working to better match their income with their expenses, their inflow with their outflow. What can we do to start looking at that? I know for me, back in the day, when I was missing those credit card payments by just a few days, it took me a while, but then I found out that I could actually call up a credit card company and a lot of other utilities and ask them to change the date. And just shifting a date, just even a few days for me, was critical in making sure I was paying things on time and not getting hit with late fee after late fee after late fee. Right? Because I think it was Kyle who was saying that those $15 here and there or whatever the late fee is, it crushes you after a while, especially when you have a very tight budget. So just asking for a different date goes a long way to smoothing out cash flow.
Yeah, don't be afraid to just threaten to leave. Because, I mean, like, obviously they'd like to charge you the late fee this one time, but they're, like, credit card companies and loan companies in general are great at playing the long-term game. And as long as you're their customer for the long term, they're going to make way more money off you than if they sort of drive you away with one payment that you're particularly focused on. So just threaten to leave. I have yet to have someone stick to their guns, and I'm like, that's fine. I just talked to your competitor. Of course, I never did take the time to talk to their competitor. I just Googled it. And, yeah, I just got done talking to your major competitor, and they said they wouldn't have a problem with customer service doing this. And then usually they just kick me to some manager with a super important title to be named later, and they give me an extension or a break or whatever the case is. I don't do it very often, but...
And I think as long as you're not taking advantage of it, if you call up a company and say, look, you know what, I get paid on the 15th, and you guys are giving me a due date that's just too close, can we just shift it 5 or 10 days? And if you just call up that one time and ask, they're going to be pretty good about it. It's when you call up every month or every other month, can you shift it, can you shift it, can you shift it? They're going to start basically saying no because they're catch on to what they're doing. But, they want you to pay. I mean, yeah, they get late fees also, but it's easier to just have you pay everything too. So I think they're usually pretty good with working with you on those types of things. Any other ideas or tips for people who want to get a better grasp of their cash flow and how they can get moving to match things up?
Yeah, so I think a big one is getting your bills to be synchronized with your pay dates. And most bills are monthly. And it's a little unfortunate that the most common pay cycle is to be paid every other week. So over a few months, you're not always paid on the same date, and so you might at one point get your paycheck just before a bill is due. But 3 months from now, the pay date's changed, so you actually got the bills due before your pay comes in. So it's a little bit of like a running game to get your paycheck always in ahead of when your bills are due. I think the other tool, which is what we're building out, is a way to tap into your pay before payday. And that then lets you make the timing changes not only on your bills, but also to make the timing changes on when you receive your pay.
So just we were going to discuss what your company does a little later on, but just so that people out there listening understand, ActiveHours, you allow people to access their money that they're going to be paid before their actual pay date. So if they have cash flow issues, they have access to that money before it would otherwise be in their bank.
Exactly. It's like an ATM into your unpaid wages.
Okay. And let's talk about tools. Is there anybody have any tools they use to help manage their cash flow to work for them?
I think I've mentioned the one I've used quite a bit on several of the shows is You Need a Budget, also known as YNAB. It's a great tool for managing your daily expenses and coming up with a zero-based budget, and then kind of getting ahead of the cycle and making sure that you have enough money to cover even next month's bills in your account. So you're basically getting ahead of the game, so you don't have to worry about these things. So that's what we use at our house. It's been a great way for us to stay on top of exactly what our expenses are, and then also finding ways to cut down expenses so that our income better matches our expenses. So
I think any personal finance software is very helpful where you can sit back and take a look at what's going on and plan ahead. I use MoneyDance. That's what I use to keep track of my spending, and I can go in and see where I'm at. And then the online banking that many banks offer, I think, is a great tool so that you can go in and see. I know a lot of the time I'm transferring money from one place to another, and automatic things are happening, and so being able to go in and see and make sure everything's happening the way it should and that all the moving parts are still moving is very important.
And also just maybe the old school method of just looking at your bills, looking at the due dates, list them all out, and when do you get paid, and look and see how they match up. I mean, one thing that we've kind of always done in one way, shape, or form is just balancing the bills out. So usually the mortgage hits in the first of the month or beginning of the month, and that's always going to be a big one. So that's going to eat a chunk of our change up. So we try to have all the other bills hit after the next pay cycle, so that we're not bunching them all together, or we pay everything with one and then we worry about surviving until the next paycheck. So by just splitting things out across, that helps a lot. So what about people with irregular income? Anything that they can do to help themselves with their cash flow? I mean, it seems like it's almost a little bit easier when you have regular income, because you know exactly when you're going to get paid and you know mostly when your bills are going to be. But when your income is maybe hitting in different places, how can you better plan for that?
So one of the things that I do is we ended up getting a personal line of credit with the same bank that has our primary checking and connecting them, so that if something does fall through the cracks, or if there is an issue or something happens, then it can just draw automatically it automatically draws from that line of credit, and then we can turn around and pay it off before there's interest when the money actually arrives. That's one of the things we've done with our variable income, because we do want to make sure that we are contributing to our retirement account, we are contributing to the emergency fund, we're making sure our taxes are covered, all of that stuff. So having that has really helped us. I know people are going to be getting out the pitchforks, but line of credit has been great to have for us. It's better than paying a return check fee. It's better than paying an overdraft fee. It's just really easy, and it's really connected, and it's been a very big help for us as far as just as a backstop. It's not something that we use every month, and most months it's not even an issue. Most months we're fine, but it's just there as a backstop, and it's a great way to have peace of mind.
And you just reminded me something there regarding overdrafts. A lot of banks will let you connect your checking account maybe to a credit card through that bank, just for overdraft instances, or to another account, so that if your checking goes over, it might hit somewhere else. So this way you're not hit with that overdraft fee. So if that's something that happens to you occasionally, you certainly don't want to use that as a crutch all the time, but you do have that option. That's something to maybe look into and think about as well. So I think we've done
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say also with a variable income, one of the things that I've seen done in the past and that I used to do that maybe I should get back to, but is looking at, the average amount with the total take home after taxes that I had the year before, divided by 12, that's your monthly income, and you base your cash flow needs on that, monthly number, and then if you go over, you put the extra in. You put the extra amount into an account that you can access for months when you're under.
Sounds like a good technique. So I think we've gone over cash flow pretty well here, and certainly have hammered into, hopefully, everybody how important it is to go into your particular finances and find ways to make your cash flow work better for your expenses. So what I'd like to do is go around our panel and get a final word on cash flow as we wrap up here. Kyle, what's your final word on cash flow?
I think it's important when talking about cash flow to realize that we're not just talking about one check from your one job that you have, or if you have two part-time jobs, it's not just those two checks. Cash flow ideally will encompass as many different sources as possible. So if any one source gets lost for one reason or another, you have others to fall back on, and you can look at unconventional techniques for your cash flow. You know, the sharing economy right now, Airbnb, different things like that. You can look at the whole roommates deal. You can look at part-time jobs, tradespeople. I'm super jealous. They have all sorts of opportunities for little side gigs here and there to help with their cash flow. So diversify as much as possible, and you can disaster-proof your life a little bit better.
Yeah, good point on diversifying your income there. I meant to mention something about that earlier on, and I'm glad you brought that back into the conversation. Tom, what's your final word on cash flow?
Cash flow is pretty much the simplest thing we kind of discuss in personal finance. If you don't have enough money to cover your expenses, that kind of throws everything else out the window. Like Kyle mentioned earlier about wanting to invest or anything like that. Like you got to cover your expenses first. So it's pretty simple math. It's really the base of almost all of our personal finance talks. So yeah, huge deal, and people should look at their cash flow and make sure it's working for them.
And Miranda, what's your final word on cash flow?
Timing is so important. It's just when so many people don't pay attention to when all of this is happening, and if there's anything that being a freelancer has taught me, it's when matters so much. And so pay attention to that and have backstops in place so that when things don't happen right when you expect them to, you have a kind of plan B to fall back on.
Peter, your final word on cash flow?
Basically, the cash flow is all about staying in control of your finances. It's about knowing where you're at today with your money, tracking your incoming income and tracking those outgoing expenses, and then finding out what can work best for you as far as making sure they stay in balance. For me, that means spending all of my money on paper before the month even begins and knowing where my money is going to be allocated, and using other systems like Unity Budget to stay on top of it day to day. So sit down, figure out where your money's going, coming in and going out, and then find out what's the best plan for you to make it work the best for you.
And Ram, if you'll close out our final word on cash flow, please.
So I think cash flow management is super important. If you mess it up, it's crazy expensive. And it's got a huge impact on your life and your relationships. We did a survey of hourly workers, and 1 in 4 of them did not celebrate Christmas on time because they were waiting for payday. And 1/3 of the hourly workers actually pushed back a doctor's appointment to payday. And so the implications are huge, not just from a cost, but also from the quality of your life. And to manage cash flow, you should look at both sides. You should look at your expenses, but also your income. And if the income is not sufficient, there's so many other choices today. There's Airbnb, there's Lyft, Uber, TaskRabbit. I think there's lots of things that you could do on a short-term basis to help you on the income side as well.
Good stuff. I'm loving your statistics today, Ram. Very eye-opening. And thank you, Ram, for joining us. For people out there, can you please tell them a little bit about what you do with your company, ActiveHours?
Yeah, sure. So ActiveHours is a way for people to access their pay when they want it. So it's an on-demand paid service. We work with hourly employees as well as certain 1099 workers. We work with Lyft and Uber drivers. And really, if you look at it, today, for some reason, we've kind of forced a 2-week waiting period on your wages. So you go work, but you don't get your money as soon as you've worked. It's stuck in the system, and it's stuck there for 2 weeks. And we're forcing everyone to manage their lives with a little bit of money that's in their bank account, when there's way more that they've worked for, and we're not letting them have access to it. And so through ActiveHours, we're basically giving you a way to access the money that you've already earned, but is not yet in your bank account.
And that's ActiveHours.
Yep.
For those that want to look it up.
Yes.
So thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight at the Money Mastermind Show. If you have any questions, please follow up with us at our site, moneymastermindshow.com. We'd love to hear them. And thank you again. Make sure you follow our podcast on iTunes and on Stitcher. And until next week, be good with your money. Good night.
Thanks for joining us on the Money Mastermind Show. Get more information at moneymastermindshow.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on iTunes and YouTube and follow us on Google+.